But joining us today, and you can still, they're still setting up, is Scott Mitchell. He's our museum director. He's a professional archaeologist, and he can tell us a lot about how the Native Americans would have used bows and arrows and atlatls, and he'll tell us what an atlatl is. And then Alan Ivory is a visiting scientist from the University of Florida, and he's out here at Silver River Museum this school year. He's also available to help your class do more science, and I'll let him tell you more about that later on. So here's what we're going to do. We are going to go to Alan and Scott out on the archery range and Atlatl range. They're going to tell us a little bit about the equipment that they have. They're going to go ahead and have a little competition between the two of them. And then we can hear more from them, and we can have some time for questions and answers. Okay, give me a thumbs up if that sounds good to you. All right, Scott, Alan, I'm handing it over to you.
Okay, all right, I'll start. Let me get a couple of things here. All right, so good morning, boys and girls. How is everybody? Good. So I heard Miss Benavides tell you that I was an archaeologist, and I have to tell you, archaeologists are scientists that study people based on things they left behind from long ago. So one example would be artifacts, and artifacts are things that people made. So here's an example of an artifact that we find in Florida, and a lot of people call these arrowheads. You may have heard that before, right? It's a big stone, sharp point that's made by breaking the stone in a controlled way. And the pre-Columbian Indians did not have metal, so this was the sharpest material they could find. So they would make tools like this that actually are not arrowheads. These are spear points that were used on spears, and the spears were thrown with an atlatl. I heard Miss Benavides mention atlatls as well. The Native Americans didn't have the bow and arrow the whole time. They invented it about 2,000 years ago. But we know that they were here about 12,000 years ago. So that leaves 10,000 years of people in Florida without the bow and arrow. So what did they do? They used spears. Spears like this, okay? And so these stone points would be on the end of the spear shaft, and this would be the cutting point for hunting because they couldn't go to a grocery store. They had to go out and catch their own food. All right, so this is a spear point, and it's quite a bit heavier and thicker than an arrow point. We're going to talk about why arrow points and spear points are different sizes. They're both fairly thin. Spear point is much larger and heavier. The arrow tip is a lot smaller and lighter. Can you see the difference between those two tools? They both serve the same purpose. They're both cutting points.
This is evolution too.
But they're made for different tools. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about those tools. So I told you they had the atlatl first, and I have an atlatl. This is what one of those stone points might look like on the tip of a spear or a dart. You'll hear it referred to atlatl spear or atlatl dart. And the atlatl is a stick with a hook on the end, and I'll show you how it works in a minute. But it's basically like a spear thrower or a spear launcher. So the tip of the spear has the stone cutting point. The back of the spear has feathers we call fletching. And you can think of these as airplane wings. They help the spear to fly straight as it travels through the air, okay? And the atlatl hook goes into the little hole on the back of the spear, just like that. And then you hold it like this, and when you launch the spear, you catapult it with the atlatl. Now what the atlatl does is it essentially makes your arm longer. So a little short person has a short arm. Big tall person like me has big long orangutan arms, right? Who could throw a spear harder? The short person with the little arms or big old Scott Mitchell with his long orangutan arms, right? I've got more power. I can throw a spear harder because I have longer arms. Now I'm going to back up, but I want you to watch, pay attention. If this is the tip of the atlatl where the spear connects, think of that think of that as your hand. If you didn't have the atlatl, if you were just throwing the spear with your hand, the tip of the atlatl becomes your hand. Now, watch what this does. If I double this out, it makes my arm, which is already pretty long, twice as long. It doubles the length of your arm, okay? So it's kind of like a big lever. Now, the main difference between an atlatl and the bow and arrow is that the user for the atlatl puts all of the power into the spear with their arm. Alan, let me see your bow just for a minute. The user for a bow and arrow lets the bow do the work. The bow is the spring, so the user pulls the string back and all of the energy is stored in the bow itself, and when you release the string, the arrow flies. And Alan will demonstrate the arrow, but think of that as the main difference. With the atlatl, I'm supplying the energy. With the bow and arrow, the bow does a lot of the work, and that's why it's a little more efficient and faster. But we'll talk about bows in just a minute. All right, so this is a prehistoric replica of an arrow. We're going to compare it to the atlatl. So the atlatl has a pretty big stone point. Look at the arrow tip. It's sharp and small. It's made to fly through the air easily. The shaft of the arrow is also much smaller. And if we start here at the beginning, we keep the tips equal. There's the end of the arrow. It's a lot shorter. The end of the atlatl dart is way out here. It's much longer. So the atlatl dart is heavier and longer and has a bigger point. The arrow is shorter and lighter and travels much faster. So those are the differences. All right, now, Alan, do you want to come and show the bow and arrow? And then once he gets done showing you his archery equipment, then we will we'll have a competition to see who can be more accurate and which projectile goes deeper into the target, okay?
Hello, everyone. So like Scott was saying, all the power, well, I do have to pull it back. All of the energy is stored, all that potential energy is stored in this bow. And that can force this arrow to go mighty fast. Now, what do you think happens with the smaller arrow versus that bigger spear? Which one's gonna go faster? Usually it's something smaller, it can go faster, but we might have equal force.
Yep.
So I can go and show you me shooting this arrow down. Let's see if you can see my target. There you go, you can see my target.
Why don't you go ahead and, you want to tell him you're going to shoot 4?
All right, I'll go and shoot all 4 then.
Okay.
Something we're gonna go and test later is how far this arrow can go into the target, all right?
So I'm going to come a little bit closer to you. Is that good?
That's good.
Can you see the target?
Yes, I can.
All right. Go ahead and shoot all 4, and then we'll take the camera up. After he shoots all 4, we're going to bring the camera up and we'll show you how he did with arrow placement. And then I will use the atlatl and show you how the atlatl throws the darts. Oh my goodness. You probably can't see it, but he just about hit the exact same spot with the second arrow. That's good. That means it's accurate. Oh, that one flew a little bit. I don't know. We might be going hungry tonight, fellow Native Americans. Remember that the Native Americans, before the Europeans arrived, they did not have grocery stores and rifles and things like that. They had to either farm and raise their own food or go out and catch it. All right, Alan, you want to take them up and show them how you did?
All right, well, I started out pretty good, but it went downhill pretty quick. So there were my first 2 shots. Let's see, can you see right there? These 2 almost hit each other, but these 2 went a little off kilter, but still pretty good. Now let's go and see what Scott can do with his.
So here's your 3 marks for your tripod.
All right, thank you. There we go.
All right, so for the atlatl, now remember that the atlatl, I'm using my body to put the motion, so you'll see a lot more movement, and the target is actually a little bit close for an atlatl, for me anyway, because I don't use atlatls very often, but you'll see how it works here.
How are you gonna do it? Look how long it is.
All right, so remember, we're going to put the hook of the atlatl in the back of the spear, and then it's rested here on the atlatl, and I hold it with my fingers,
What is 11?
and obviously I hold on to the atlatl and the spear launches.
All right. Not bad. Oh.
But now that's weight distribution because the Atlatl is heavier.
So the atlatl spear is much heavier. It actually caused the target to tip forward.
You're dealing with distribution.
All right, can you see okay?
You would hunt different prey with that. Probably bigger. Which means you would feed more people in the village.
Miss Liptek's class, make sure you hold that question. We're going to have Q&A, and I bet Mr. Scott would love to answer that question. It was an excellent question.
All right, remember how accurate I was with my bow? Look at what Scott was able to do.
All over the place.
All of mine are right here, but Scott's just taking up the entire board.
So if you want to stand off to the edge,
Yep.
go off on that edge for me. All right. And if you can film depth, we're going to, there's the depth of that one. Okay.
What would you estimate that to be in inches?
I would say 8
inches.
8 inches.
Okay, so a penetration of 8 inches on that arrow.
About 7. About 9.
9 to 10. Yep.
What do you think the bigger one?
11. Probably 11. The target is soft in some areas, so it goes in a little bit deeper. But that gives you about a good average of about 8 or 9 inches, I would think. Okay.
All right, so now let's see what this Atlatl can do with his darts.
And you see how the atlatl darts are all over the place. So we're going to check penetration on the atlatl darts. Oh, look at that. That's only about 5 inches.
Much less.
So not as deep. That one's maybe 6 or 7 inches, a little deeper. This one's probably only about 5 inches.
It should be about probably 11, 12 centimeters.
And this one's probably 6 inches. So the atlatl darts did not go as deep and they weren't as accurate. Now, part of that is because of me. I'm not an expert in atlatls. But the archery arrows, they went much deeper and it looked like Alan was a lot more accurate. So think about this. When the Indians in Florida invented the bow and arrow, they didn't just throw away the atlatl, they actually used both. So it's almost like two different weapons for maybe different types of hunting. So if you were hunting something small where you had to be very, very accurate, you might use an arrow. If you were hunting something much larger where you wanted the power of a big atlatl dart, an atlatl may be the better hunting weapon of choice. So they might have used them differently that way, but when they invented the bow and arrow, they didn't just throw away the atlatl and the atlatl dart. They actually used both. And we know that because archaeologists find both types of artifacts together in sites that are that date to like 2,000 years ago and more recently when they invented the bow and arrow. We find arrowheads along with atlatl dart points. So we know that they were actually using both of them. Okay. Erin, do you think of anything else that you would want us to cover?
So I think if you guys were listening closely, you heard a lot of those force and motion concepts that you've been covering. I think you saw directly how the mass of those darts had a big effect, right? Now, we don't have a way of comparing the force that the bow applied versus the atlatl because we couldn't very easily measure what Scott was applying with the force. But we do know that the mass of those darts was much greater. So I am sure at this time you guys have quite a few questions. So what we're going to do, oh, go ahead, Scott.
I was going to say one thing that I think we would have noticed if we had a different camera angle from the side was that the arrows went straight and fast, and the Atlatl darts kind of lobbed like you would throw a baseball, you know, kind of an arc almost.
Yeah.
Yep.
So
Okay.
what we'll do is we will take turns and we'll go from one class to the next. And I'm just going to go in the order that I see them on my screen. And we will keep answering questions for the next 10 minutes. And if at the end of the 10 minutes you have more questions, you can feel free to email me those questions. And I'll make sure that between myself and Alan and Mr. Scott, we get them all answered. So let's start with Ms. Liptak's class. Do you guys have a question that you'd like answered?
We were going to ask about the distribution of weight between both of the bow and arrow and the Atlatl.
Were you guys able to hear that question?
Distribution of weight between both the arrow and the Atlatl.
Come over here. All right. What was the question again? I'm sorry.
They wanted to know about the distribution of weight between the arrow and the, are you talking about the bow and the Atlatl or the arrow and the dart, the projectile?
Arrow and the dart.
Okay, the arrow and the dart.
The weight, I would say the Atlatl dart is probably 5 times as heavy as the arrow, at least. So the weight and the mass is much greater, and obviously it's much larger. I don't know if that answers your question, but the Atlatl darts are much, much heavier.
Okay. Let's go to Miss Stickley's class. What question do you have, Miss Stickley?
Okay. Whatever you ask your question. Look in the camera and ask your question.
Maybe if what's the Lord's name again?
Scott, Mr. Mitchell.
Mr.
Yeah.
Mitchell would if he would give it more force, would it go more in? Because like
I'm sure, yes, because you're controlling the amount of force with how hard you throw it. It's almost like throwing a football or a baseball. You can throw it really, really hard or a little bit lighter. Now, I wasn't putting my full force into it because I'm not that accurate. I don't practice a lot. And also the target was pretty close. But someone who really knew what they were doing and the target wasn't that close, they probably would be throwing it twice as hard as I would be. And I think that the dart would penetrate quite a bit deeper.
Something else I wanted to go mention is whenever I'm pulling the bow back, I'm pulling it back to the same point every single time. And so I'm applying about 30 pounds of force to that arrow every single time. Whenever Scott is shooting his dart, he can control how fast he wants to go and hit it, which can be good or bad depending on what you're trying to do. It
can be variable. Yeah.
All right, Mrs. Andriola, your turn for a question.
All right, here we go.
how do they shape the arrow tips?
Can you repeat it? Aaron, can you repeat it?
How do they shape the arrow tips?
Oh, okay. Let me get that out of my pocket and I will show you.
You may go.
That's a good question. They call that flint napping. Flint is the stone, and napping, it's not like when you take a nap. Napping is the act of actually shaping the stone. Okay, so if you think of this as just a raw piece of flint, and you take another piece of flint and you hit it on the edge this way, it causes a flake of stone to flake off the bottom. And if you practice this, you can control how you knock the little flakes of stone off the bigger piece of stone. Yeah. And when you do that, you can actually shape the big piece of stone by removing other smaller flakes of stone from it. And then you can take something pointy like the end of a deer antler, you know, almost shaped like a big pencil, and they can push little tiny flakes off of the edge to make that edge nice and sharp, almost like a knife blade. So the short answer is they would control how they broke this rock with other rocks. They had a skill and they had in their mind, they knew what that arrow point or that dart point was going to look like before they finished. And so they would actually shape that rock to make it into the shape that they wanted it. Okay. So that's called flit napping.
Okay. Miss Liptek's class, we have time for another round of questions from everyone. So do you guys have another question?
Yes, we do.
Raise your hand now. You need to be listening.
All right. So Miss Liptek, we're ready when you are with your question.
What type of animals did they hunt between the smaller arrow and the bigger one?
In Florida, before the Spanish explorers arrived in 1513, so about 500 years ago, we call that the pre-Columbian time, all that time before. Before the Europeans arrived, we had all kinds of animals in Florida that we don't have anymore today. They even had wolves here at one point. So some of the larger animals that Native Americans would hunt would be bison, elk, deer. Out west, maybe antelope, things like that. But in Florida, certainly bison and deer. And then the smaller animals would be rabbits, squirrels, ducks, raccoons. And remember, they couldn't go to the grocery store, so they would pretty much eat whatever they could catch.
Scott, before the bow and arrow, when they just had the atlatl in prehistoric times, what were some of the largest animals they were hunting with the atlatl?
Oh, that's a good question. Now, if you go all the way back to the Ice Age, which was the Ice Age ended about 12,000 years ago. There were people here. Back in the Ice Age, if you saw the movie, we had animals like the Columbian mammoth or the mastodon, which were basically ancestors to elephants. They looked like big elephants. They would hunt those animals with the atlatl spear and the atlatl. We know this because we find spear points actually in and amongst the fossilized mammoth bones. And we also find cut marks on those fossilized mammoth bones that prove that the Native Americans actually killed the animal and cut it up for food. So starting with the Ice Age, really big animals like mammoths and mastodons. And then later, when those animals became extinct, large animals like elk and deer and bison.
Okay. Miss Stickley's class, your turn for a question.
Go ahead, Charlotte.
How much pressure do you think Mr. Allen applied on the arrow?
How much pressure do you think you applied on the arrow?
Well, pulling the string back is about 30 pounds of pressure.
Right. So you can measure the pull on a bow. If you take a little scale and you hook it to the string, actually in Miss Benavides' video with her son Ethan, they demonstrate the poundage on a
That's
bow.
the string scale that you guys took.
Right. So you can pull it a certain distance and it will measure how many pounds of pressure. So the bow that Alan was using is about a 30-pound bow. So it's about 30 pounds of pressure.
Whenever you put on that tiny little arrow, that's how you can cause so much force.
Okay.
So-
Miss Andriola. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to say another way to describe that is it's how hard you would have to push to move 30 pounds. If you had a 30-pound weight on top of the table, that's how hard you'd have to push to move that 30-pound weight.
All right. Mrs. Andriola.
How did the people live in the past hunt animals before they had bow and arrows?
Did you understand?
Not all of it.
She said, how did the people live in the past before they had bow and arrows?
Well, they had the atlatl before they had the bow and arrow. And before they invented the atlatl, way back, we think that they probably were just scavenging, finding food and eating lots of nuts and berries and just eating whatever they could find. And maybe some theories are that really early humans who didn't have the bow and arrow or the atlatl, they might gang up together, and let's say a lion killed a gazelle. They might chase the lion off if there was enough of them, and then they would steal the gazelle. So if you go back far enough in time, very early people, before they had tools like the bow and arrow and the atlatl, they were actually just gathering food wherever they could find it and maybe stealing food that other predators had killed.
Thank you.
All right. So I want to go ahead and give Alan just 1 minute to talk a little bit about his role as our guest scientist at Silver River Museum, because he can offer you some resources above and beyond what Silver River is offering. All right, Alan.
All right, so like Aaron was saying, I'm a UF biologist or ecologist, focusing on frogs, and I've worked with fish in the Grand Canyon, salamanders up in the mountains. So I've worked with lots of animals, but I can help with everything from doing population dynamics. If you're trying to go and count how many animals are in an area, you're going to catch all of them. So I can help with teaching you how you can count. I can teach you like about genetics and those sorts of things.
And Alan, you're available to help teachers kind of plan a virtual lesson or field trip according to the topic that they are interested in and their students are interested in, correct?
Right. That's the beauty of ecology, is it ties into so many different things, to water, to earth, and everything. So I can help teachers make lesson plans, or I can go and speak in on a lesson if you need help on it, all sorts of things.
And Alan, you've also received a donation of some water quality testing kits that you can make available for classroom teachers, correct?
Correct. So I have a bunch of water quality testing kits where you can test pH and how much stuff is in the water to see if your drinking water your school is even healthy to drink.
And so even though you guys are done with your unit on mixtures and solutions, I know you're still doing Inquiry Mondays and you have a lot of nature of science lessons that your teachers are still working on, and Alan is available to support. So if you guys want to hook up with Alan and work with a scientist one-on-one in your classroom, have your teacher shoot me an email, okay? All right, guys, that is our time for today. Thank you very much for joining us. Scott and Alan, thank you for taking time out on the range.
All right, guys. Good to see you. Hello, Mrs. Stickley, by the way.
All right, guys. And if there are any more unanswered questions, send them to me in an email, okay?
I'll say thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
All right, bye, guys.
Lights, please, Dakota.